All right, let's begin. Welcome everyone to episode 3 of the Let's Talk Privacy and Technology series, where we talk and feature discussions with privacy experts, practitioners, and innovators in the intersection of privacy and technology. We talk about things like privacy engineering, privacy enhancing technologies, data ownership, the rise of privacy tech, cybersecurity, and more. I'm Lourdes Turecha, your host. I'm the Privacy Tech and Law Fellow and Adjunct Professor at Santa Clara Law. And in previous lives, I was a privacy and cybersecurity practitioner in Big Law, in Fortune 300, in the cybersecurity industry. And now I'm working and writing about the rising privacy tech landscape. Today, we have a very special guest. His name is Rama Veeraragoo, and he is the CEO and co-founder of the privacy tech startup DocuVision.ai. He's going to share with us his journey from law to tech entrepreneurship, as well as provide us with an explainer on a technical concept like most of our guests do. And today he's going to talk to us about redaction. Hi, Rama, and welcome to the Let's Talk Privacy and Technology series.
Hi, Lourdes. Hi, everyone else. Such a privilege and pleasure to be here today.
Thank you for making time for us. We have live attendees, but this is also going to be shared widely in the community. So Santa Clara Privacy Law students and alumni and practitioners on the Santa Clara Law YouTube channel and in other social media outlets.
Great. So, well, hi to everyone asynchronously as well.
Awesome. Let's begin. How did you end up in privacy and technology? Talk to us about what your journey was like. I'm sure many of our students and even alumni would enjoy hearing about your unique journey into the space.
Yeah, it's not something I would say I'd predicted from the outset. So I was a practicing lawyer at a law firm, Freshfields initially in London, and then as in-house counsel at Credit Suisse, a bank. And my focus area was really not really privacy related at all, which was structured finance and derivatives. But I did get to see privacy up close on one of the transactions we did, where we were looking at pension plan members and how we were transferring longevity risk from a pension plan for a company. And there we really had to dig deep into what constitutes personal data, who was handling these people's information, did it constitute personal data, and what was that cutting off kind of line between personal data and anonymized data for that context, and what special process we needed to do as an organization to be able to do that transaction in a way that met the people's expectations and the law. And so that was a kind of first, if you want, foray into it as a practitioner. But then, and then kind of maybe veering off slightly on a detour outside of privacy, a few years ago, I decided I had an idea for a tech startup and wanted to do it. And I couldn't imagine myself not doing it. And so that the company was Good Ripple, and we were trying to use technology to drive micro kindness behaviors in organizations. And so we built a few products, including a Slack bot that helped people send fun positive messages to each other on Slack. And so I came out here to do it, knew nothing about tech, knew nothing about, didn't know many people out here. And so moved out here and tried to build it as best as I could with other people. And it's during that time, I wasn't even calling it privacy in my own mind, but I looked at, it was some form of injustice and abuse of power that I felt that a lot of the companies, especially the dominant tech companies that were monetizing our data, that it was almost that they just presented us with a fait accompli and said, look, we're using your data. We had no voice in that process to decide what people were doing with our data. And I'm starting from the assumption that we have, let's say we assume that we have some rights to that data in some way and how it's used. And it's really from that vantage point that I got really interested into how these effects were potentially driving how our thinking is shaped. I remember in 2016, I wrote something and gave a talk around that. And I wasn't even calling it privacy. It was something else in my mind. And then fast forward a few years later, I decided to start DocuVision.ai, and the focus there was to help organizations better protect personal information in what we are calling unstructured places like documents and emails. But the kind of origin story of how we started was with my co-founders, Alex and Mahmood. They had run a company called App Advice before, and they were seeing as an app developer how much data they were collecting. And so many companies have our data today out there and using it in many different ways, some for good, some for bad. And so we really felt that there was something should be done, whether it was going to be us or with other people. I think there was a need to do something. So that's how I kind of really got deeper, from as a practitioner seeing it, as a consumer seeing it, but not even being aware of privacy as a field, but calling it something else, and then more directly getting into actually doing what is considered to be privacy tech startup.
Right. I mean, wow, that's quite a journey. And I wrote down a couple notes, and one of them was, you mentioned that you were in structured finance, but you did get into a couple of cases where you started looking into, personal versus anonymized data. And I'm assuming this was pre-GDPR. This was under the EU directive or the UK's
Correct.
version of, data protection laws in the UK at the time.
Yeah.
And so I particularly, there's this thread where you have that background. Europe, as we know, I mean, privacy is very cultural, and Europe has a different culture of privacy than we do in the US or even in California. And so I wrote down, you weren't even thinking about it as privacy, but abuse of power. That's something that came up recently in conversations with privacy experts about how privacy is about fundamental human rights, and that's a very European concept as well. It's not a US concept that I'm seeing emerge given your background. And so is that something that you're incorporating in your approach at DocuVision.ai? As I remember, at this time, you're a B2B tech startup, correct?
Correct.
Does it come out at all in how you approach privacy, even though you're an enterprise privacy tech startup as opposed to a consumer privacy tech startup?
Yeah, in many different ways, but yes. So I think the reason we're kind of even working on this is related to that kind of more fundamental kind of interest as a consumer, and that drives a lot of the thinking of how we even think about engineering the product, and the decisions that are being made at the product level, but also I would say, how. I think we are one player in a growing ecosystem of privacy players, and you're kind of at the forefront of leading that initiative of really bring people interested in this topic together and seeing where this goes and the progress around that. So we do feel that even if it's not directly related to our product and a business and serving those B2B customers, there's an important conversation that is happening and that we want to have a voice in, and if we can drive a positive outcome in as well.
And there's a point to be made there that how companies like DocuVision.ai empowers its enterprise customers and improve their data practices and data infrastructure. There is that indirect effect of trickling down to consumer privacy, and how those customers of yours could better provide better choices and better tools and better data privacy practices with tools like yours.
Yeah, no, great. We do see that kind of knock-on effect of what we're doing with a B2B customer, and what knock-on effect that has on the individual consumer in terms of how their data is being used. So where we are today, we're really focused on helping organizations better protect the sensitive information that they have in their emails, in their documents, their file storage, and as they're sharing those documents or storing them, if there are better ways for them to share that. So what we do is we help them find all these different types of sensitive information, and we can help them redact it. And at the end, we can go into some depth as to what that is. And so that the effect for the organization is that it reduces the risk of that data being potentially seen by the wrong person in the organization, abused internally, or potentially even abused outside of the organization. So for us, that is the more kind of that aspect of privacy is where we are really focused on. There are other aspects we're not really touching, which is maybe about consumer rights or more direct kind of tool to help them exercise the rights. But even there, like we can help these businesses understand what data they have, so that when a consumer makes a request, they can use our tool to better, more easily find the information relating to that individual, and then redact other people's information which shouldn't be then disclosed to that individual as well.
Exactly, and you touch upon a point about how, I mean, this is such a nascent field, privacy tech, right? And there's just so many privacy problems, and even in compliance itself, or just B2B enterprise privacy, there's just so much that a company like DocuVision.ai can just focus on this one thing, unstructured data and emails and the redaction of it, and make an impact there. So let me pivot and ask, what makes you excited about privacy and technology? I mean, there are a host of interesting things going on right now, but I'm curious, given your work, what's top of mind for you right now, and what's most exciting about it?
Yeah, I would say there are kind of a few dimensions which make it very exciting. So that there's massive changes happening along several dimensions simultaneously, and that is a really exciting place to be. So at the political level, we are seeing that collectively we are, deciding that we want a different type of privacy, and so that's been expressed and continues to be expressed through, in California, for example, through the CCPA and the ongoing negotiations, for lack of a better term, for where we get to. So that, I think that's hugely interesting. I think there are organizations that are responding, that what I call existing organizations that are responding in terms of how they better meet those new customer expectations. And that's a kind of fascinating development that I think have really big impact. And then there's the other bucket, which is new solutions like ours and others, new technology companies and other organizations providing solutions to businesses or individuals to help them be better at privacy, or be able to satisfy the expectations of the consumer ultimately around privacy. And I think, and all these are happening really fast at the same time. So that's a very exciting place to be, I think, for me as a consumer, but also as a founder of a privacy tech startup.
Exactly, and I feel the same way. It just seems like the timing is right. There's an increasing number of privacy laws all over the world, with Europe leading the way, but also California being very active with CCPA and the incoming ballot in November for CCPA 2.0. And at the federal level, we've had a slew of federal bills on privacy introduced, although we're not sure where we're going to go with that yet. How do you feel about the future of privacy in technology? Are you hopeful? Are you dreading it? Are you, do you have any other sentiments about it? How do you think about it?
Yeah, I think starting with the political aspect, I think it's a fascinating thing to think about, I think, which is that the lines we're drawing as to what expectations we should have reflected in the law is something that's going to continue to evolve. And I think the CCPA of the California will probably set a sort of baseline to an extent. But I believe that the lines are something that people are going to be debating for a number of years to come, and I think that's also a function of risk and trade-offs. So I was thinking of a very extreme example to illustrate that point. So privacy there's a concept of privacy as a human right, and there's also, I think, privacy as a political compromise, of decision of reflecting different people's preferences. So an extreme example is, let's say there was one person who we knew had a technology or weapon that would instantly like destroy the world. And we knew that person had that intent. And let's say that the only viable solution to stop that was that the governments of the world would have to surveil everyone. Now, the question is, if that were the kind of artificially constructed situation, would we draw the line very differently as to what levels of privacy we would be comfortable with? And I believe the answer is in that situation, it's a very artificial situation, but we would probably say, yes, surveil us all, because the risks is just too high and too real.
Devil's advocate, and I want to, because this is one of those debates that we've had forever in privacy, right? Like the trade-off between privacy and national security, or any other public good, like for instance, in the middle of pandemic right now, privacy versus public health. And I think it's Dan Sullivan, I believe I have the book right here, It's Nothing to Hide, The False Trade-Off Between Privacy and Security, where he talks about how that's actually a myth. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. I mean, I do agree with the point that you made, that we will have trade-offs and compromises, but I think there are instances where governments push it too far, when they argue that it's the only way to go, that we can't have privacy in order to achieve a certain public benefit, like national security or public health. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I really completely agree with you, but I think it also highlights the difficulty, which is that in that situation, typically the government will have a lot more information around what is possible and the different ways of what the risk is. And so the perception of the risk by the general public might be a function of that imbalance of information and the asymmetry of information, understanding the risk. So if as a society we get to the point where we really believe and we perceive that this is such a real risk, my point is that we might then be driven to draw a different line around privacy. And that's it, and although in most cases we would say, oh yeah, but there are probably other ways to solve this problem, which do not involve this erosion of privacy. The question is, who is, in that time frame, who has that information and power and influence to be able to influence that process when there's that huge imbalance and asymmetry of information between, the government and, let's say, us, the public. And I think that, to me, that's part of the issue, which is that it's about perception and what information we have and who has the power and influence in that situation.
Absolutely. I mean, and oftentimes there is the imbalance in access to information, and a lot of times the government has that advantage. But I think you made a really great point when you say, as a society, we decide. And how do we do that? We start with transparency, right? We can't decide as a society if we are kept in the dark by government when it comes to these things. And we can learn from history, like after post 9/11. And I think we did learn from 9/11 when, in handling the pandemic, we didn't it seems like there's much more debate and questioning and holding governments accountable for their proposals and how to handle contact tracing, for instance, and the collection of data versus how we handled it post 9/11, where there wasn't a lot of transparency. But I think your point that it has to be a societal decision that we make is a very good one.
Yeah, and I think that's a problem. We can get into that more, which is that it's hard. It's hard to really understand what is happening with our data, and it's not just government, right? It's any company, so we can dig deeper into that. I would make the claim that as individuals, even in the privacy land, so to speak, I think very few people really truly understand how much information and insight companies have about us, and it's scary. is the point that's worrying.
Exactly. It's not just Big Brother that we have to worry about. It's also big tech and other companies in general, not just the big tech companies that we think of. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So what do you think is the biggest privacy and technology challenge or issue of our time? I know different guests have different perspectives on this. Is it surveillance or the over collection of data like we were alluding to just now, or is it something else that you're more worried about?
Yeah, I think I would say going back to the political process that results in formulation of what privacy is, which reflects our various preferences. One is we don't really understand what's happening with our data, and there's kind of, I would say, and I hope that's not controversial. There's outsized influence of some of the big tech companies to influence that political decision-making process, in terms of the ability to influence the conversation. Um, for example, I would argue that the CCPA is probably the biggest privacy regulation in maybe in US history in some way, in the at least in terms of its broader impact. And I would argue that the main tech companies like Facebook and Google have not had to do anything differently in substance. And so you could look at that and say, well, is that the right outcome for society? And it's not to punish these organizations, but it's nothing against these in particular, but they are still using the same amount of information, if not more, and nothing has changed in that sense. Is that where we want to be? In terms of these organizations, not just them, but others having that type of organization. I think so. The challenge, I think, going back to your question is, is that political process going to reflect our true preferences, and are we properly informed to be able to do that? Are we able to have the right seat at the table to be able to make those, make those preferences reflected, and then those different trade-offs kind of really coming through the legislation and the process as well. I think the other challenges, I would say, I think this is going to be an evergreen challenge, which is our data will always be valuable to someone.
Yep.
So it could be for valuable to someone looking to make a profit and a profit motive, or it could be, we've already seen this, it's going to be valuable to our own government for different use cases, and maybe even more dangerously, it's going to be valuable to some other foreign actor, a government or quasi-government entity that will look to abuse our data and insights about us to potentially disrupt a voting process, right? So a legislative, a kind of voting process in the country. So that, I think we should expect to see increased innovation and sophistication from these types of players who will, increase their ingenuity to get access to our information in some way.
Right. So the first concern that you raised was the political process that results to our conception of privacy. Do you, and you brought up really, the common critiques about CCPA and how even though it's impactful, it doesn't, one of the arguments is that it doesn't really do much for consumer privacy in the end. And I think that's why folks have brought up the ballot in November to change that and to get it closer to the rights and protections under GDPR, for instance. Are you more concerned of the process here in the US versus in Europe or other jurisdictions? Or is that concern a concern that you have globally, regardless of jurisdiction?
Well, I think the two different answers or two ways of looking at it. One I think is a generalized. We should do better as a society to get a much better understanding of how our data is being used and could potentially be abused. And so I think that's a more general kind of global observation. I think the other one, which is maybe more a function of a lot of innovation in technology and how our data has been, is being used in new ways, has happened here in the US, first maybe before Europe. So even though, so the pace of the impact has been very fast, and maybe we haven't caught up as a society to kind of really figure out how it's impacting our lives. So maybe that's a kind of different context for how we are looking at the situation.
On the second, go ahead.
Now, I would also say to the Alistair McTaggart and the organization behind the CCPA and the continual developments around it, I would say it's something we should like really commend, that where individuals are like really driving it, but probably at huge personal risk, I would say. And so I think that's something that we should all really commend and back. Whether we agree with the substance where they are drawing the line, but I think the act of individuals looking to really get involved, using their own resources and at some risk is something we should. It's an example for us to look at.
Yeah, there is something commendable about fighting for consumer rights. I do have to say that you've read the critiques, including from Santa Clara, professors like Professor Goldman, for instance, about how the process and the content of the CCPA, and he's written about this extensively. But I do agree with you that there is something commendable about fighting for Californians and California consumers to have increased or strengthened privacy protections. Whether or not the CCPA actually delivers on those is something yet that we have to see. And the second thing that you brought up about data is going to continue to be valuable to different organizations, to government, to big tech. I'm curious why you chose to look at that as a negative versus a good. I mean, for some practitioners, that could be a good thing. It could mean that consumers in the future will fight harder to be able to reclaim some of the value, that with things like the CCPA's data valuation requirement for differential pricing, that this will provide more transparency as to the value of that data, of consumer data. I'm curious why that was why you brought it up as a bad, concerning thing, as opposed to a.
Yeah, no, I agree with that construct where there's a better transparency of how valuable it is, so it probably has better incentives for consumers and organizations that are using that information in a kind of transparent way. So totally agree with that. I think what I was saying was, as long as our data exists, someone is going to look to misuse it in some way. And so even if it's not those people who are valuing the information and using it, then that's a transparent trade, if I can call it that. There'll be foreign governments. There will be other companies in the private sector like Cambridge Analytica that will do something to it for some nefarious purpose. And I think what I fear there is that as we get better from a legislative perspective, from a privacy kind of standards in organizations, and as technologies like ours and others that are helping organizations better protect that information, in parallel, we're also going to see an increase in sophistication and ingenuity of some of these bad actors to look to get access to our information. So that was my point, that it's good things are happening, but at the same time, it also raises the bar for how people will behave to really get access to the information.
Exactly. The more valuable it is, the more bad actors are going to go after our data. I'm going to take a break from my own questions and take one from the audience. One of the attendees is asking, what was your experience like at Skydeck, which is a startup accelerator that DocuVision.ai participated in?
Yeah, we were very.
Sorry. Let me just finish. Was the Skydeck team particularly interested in your privacy focus, including possibly as it relates to human rights?
So we are very lucky to have been invested in by UC Berkeley's Skydeck Accelerator. So I have only great things to say about it. So if any startup across various fields, they're agnostic as to the field, they probably would love to hear from you. So I can highly commend them as very, very helpful people who have been there at the very start of our journey. So for them, I can't speak for them in terms of why they were interested in us, whether it was human rights issue or I think fundamentally, even if they are, as other investors are, they are, they have a duty to maximize their financial return.
Right.
I think in the most investors also people, and so they kind of things that they care about seem to resonate a lot more with them. So I would expect, and I'm not speaking for them, I'm just saying I would expect that our interest in privacy is also something that resonated with them as human beings.
And it certainly says something that more and more investors like the Skydeck accelerator team are starting to see the value in privacy. So historically, this is not an area that investors invested in. And privacy has not always been viewed as a value, but more as either a liability or compliance hurdle. And so as with not just with DocVision.ai, but with the rest of the privacy tech startups, it says quite a lot that investors are starting to come along and see that value that we've been talking about for years and trying to get them to understand that this is beyond checkbox compliance. There's value to data, and we need to recognize that in our investments, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're completely right. We are in, or there has been an inflection point in the investor community, and now it's less of a concern or question: is there a market for this, and how big that market is? Is the venture-sized market? I think for most investors that's no longer a question, but there will always be investors who are not there yet, and like in many other sectors, they'll miss the boat. So that's just the nature of investing.
Exactly. I think you said it was a comment that you made maybe a couple of weeks ago online in social media. The ones, or in an article that I was writing, the ones who are not going to recognize the value of privacy are going to get left behind and miss out on the opportunities in this market.
Absolutely.
So what is your advice for those who, not just the students at Santa Clara Law, but just anyone in general who is looking to break into privacy and technology? But feel free to also talk to some of our, address some of that to our privacy law students, given your background as a lawyer. I'm sure they'd appreciate your insights in that.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll get any useful advice on this one, but I'll try to generalize it and go a little bit further down. So I would start with curiosity and say, be very curious about the world. And if privacy is something you're interested in, try to get deeper into it and learn as much as you can about it. Like, for example, learn how our data is being handled today, how it's being used by companies, how it's being stored, who's using it, how it's potentially being abused. What insights do companies have about us? Like, do we, I think most people, we touched on this, don't really have a good grasp on what it really means, what insights and data companies really have on us, and how they know us better than ourselves. How much data does your ISP, your internet service provider, have on you? Your bank, Google, Facebook, obviously, and others. I think we would all be shocked to learn about how much data and insight other companies have about us, and how really, in this context, the internet works. And I think really better understanding that might help you learn where you could be potentially interested in, and what you might be interested in focusing on.
I love that. I mean, it applies to any other industry or any context. Curiosity, it's important, but particularly here, it's not hard to be curious in privacy, where there's something going on every day that's coming up. May it be new legislative proposals or scandals like Cambridge Analytica, or contact tracing apps, and such. So yep.
And I would make a plug here. So one of my hacks is to follow religiously Lourdes and the rise of the privacy tech. Wow. You will find a lot of useful information about privacy if you follow those two things.
Thank you, Rama. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
what privacy technology feature do you wish exists?
Yeah, this is more as a consumer. I've been thinking about this a bit, which is in our homes, smart tech. So, for example, smart lighting, maybe fridges, maybe opening the door, security, voice, devices. The more I think about it, is that if maybe we're already there in the present, but our every movement, our every voice occurrence, our every expression, facial, bodily expression, is being tracked, and that's being potentially seen by a company or even more. And that to me seems like a very dystopian reality to live in. It's kind of hits really close to home. Apologies for the pun, but in that kind of smart home environment or smart building environment, I do believe that if we could have the same functionality without the data being seen by organization, I think that would have a big impact in terms of feeling that we have a private space, at least a physical private space in our own homes.
Right, so something that would provide either more transparency or control over all the data that's being collected about us by our home devices and IoT devices at home is what you would.
I would say that would not even satisfy me. I would want it to be a system designed where the vendor of those solutions cannot actually see the data.
Got it.
Yeah.
This reminds me about, go ahead.
No, because we've seen some of the existing vendors who have our data, and we've heard the stories of people looking in and into that information from a couple of major companies, and also where they're potentially selling some insights and data without permission to police departments. So I think that's already happening, which is
exactly. And that really goes into one of the key principles of privacy is, well, not just one, but I can think of a couple on top of my head. One is minimizing the data that you collect to what's absolutely necessary and legitimate. And the second one is just making sure that there's, there's transparency in terms of what you're collecting. I can also, a third one just popped into my head, which is the big debate between, about government access to data. And we saw that between Apple and the FBI in the iPhone encryption case, which keeps popping up every now and then. And I believe there was a recent bill introduced about encryption and the government asking for backdoors to encryption again. I was going to say your response about the system design and the dystopian world that we could start living in reminds me of a Wired article, Nightmare on Connected Homes Tree that was written a few years ago. I'm not sure if you read that, but
no.
I'll send you a link, and I'll we'll include it in the show notes when I type up a post about this. But it's a really good article about what you just described, and it goes into length about all the things that could go wrong. I think we're towards the end of our episode. We usually end our episode with an explainer, and I wanted to, given DocuVision's work in redaction, I wanted to give you the opportunity and the task of explaining to our audience what redaction is, how it works, why is it important, and particularly in privacy, and what's the value in it that your customers are seeing?
Yeah, so let me start with what we do. So imagine you got a PDF, and that PDF might be a resume, it might be some other document that has someone's personal information. So they might have their names, phone numbers, addresses, email address, maybe gender, etc. And so, or medical information. And so what we do is we automatically analyze that file, flag to you that these are potentially sensitive information and these are the different types of sensitive information. And then you can automatically redact that information, or you can review the information that is to be redacted. And what I mean by redacted in this case is what we do is we essentially have a black box over the information that is deemed sensitive. And so I don't know, many of you might have come across the Manafort lawyers redaction error, mistake that they made. So what they did was they used some technology to apply those black boxes over a file. But unfortunately, the way, the tool wasn't very good in that although there were black boxes over the text, the sensitive text, that text was still machine readable. So if you copied and pasted the text and put it somewhere else, you'd actually be able to see the underlying information. So there are some special things that we need to do to avoid that information remaining there. So what we do in our case, in our current version of the product, is we remove that information. And we also, we remove a lot of metadata around the file as well that could contain sensitive information. And then we apply this black box over that area where the sensitive information used to be. So in that situation, it's non-hackable. So the person who sees the redacted file, it's a new file that doesn't contain the original information. So there's no way they can reverse engineer and go back to what was there before. And so a few use cases that are highly relevant to some of our customers, for example, and then we're talking to many colleagues in law here. So law firms have large processes in, for example, litigation discovery, in some privacy related cases, in M&A processes, where they need to find and redact a bunch of information, including these kind of personal information. And so we can help them do that a lot faster with our product and do that very, very fast. And we have, as people are reviewing it at the customer's end, there's this kind of self-learning built into our product so that the predictions get better for that particular context very quickly for that particular customer. And for privacy requests, especially when the information sits in places like emails and documents, we can help the company find that information a lot faster. And then as they are disclosing the information back to the requester, redact the non-sensitive information that may relate to other people. And so we can help them with that as well. And then just more generally, reducing the amount of sensitive information that they might have in a particular environment. So they might have, let's say, so we had a customer that had terabytes of information in a file storage system. So we helped them go through those, we've got emails and attachments, find sensitive information, redact those. And then they kept a copy somewhere safer where it was less accessible to people in their organization. So the more accessible version was redacted version with the sensitive information redacted.
I mean, I love this. The security geek in me is also excited beyond privacy. In security, we have this standard of, when you're deleting or redacting data, the standard has to be that it's not reversible, right? And so the Manafort example that you brought up was a big counter example to that was a mistake there in technology, and that's the problem that you guys are trying to solve. So thank you for making the world better in that regard.
Thank you.
So I want to give you the opportunity to share in any closing thoughts that you have, how our audience can reach you, where they can reach you through socials or other means that you prefer. And to thank you, of course, for your time today. I know you're very busy as a startup founder, especially in this nascent privacy tech field. So Rama, thank you. Please tell us where we can reach you and connect with you online.
Yeah, feel free to reach me on Twitter. I'm at ESQRama on Twitter. So I kept my legal roots in there, and also on LinkedIn, Rama Veeraragoo. Feel free to ping me there as well. And if you want to email me I'm at rama@docvision.ai. But it's been such a pleasure being part of this conversation and having this really fascinating conversation with you, Lourdes. And yeah, I think that we are at the beginning of a very exciting phase in terms of how our rights get defined and enforced, and how companies manage them, and solutions that help companies and consumers. So I think a very interesting time for people who are interested in the space. Happy to be a small part of it.
Yep, I mean, join us. It's an exciting place. If you're curious, like Rama was advising earlier, there's something for everyone. There's a niche there's a problem that you can solve or help solve. Again, Rama, thank you, and everyone, thank you for joining us. We'll make the recordings available on the Santa Clara YouTube channel. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.